If you'd walked through the streets of Key West, Florida in the late 1970s, you would have noticed something strange. Tourists and locals alike were wearing novelty t-shirts printed with a single baffling question. Where is Bum Fardo? To visitors, it probably looked like a joke. To the people who actually lived on the island, the name Bum Farto carried a weight that went far deeper than novelty merchandise. It was a name tied to power, corruption, and one of the most chilling vanishing acts in Florida's criminal history. Nearly 50 years later, nobody's been able to answer the question on those shirts so many years ago. Joseph Anthony Fardo was born on July 3, 1919 in Key West. He grew up across the street from Fire Station Number 1 on Green Street, and as a kid he was constantly hanging around the place, fetching coffee for the firefighters and shining their shoes. The men at the station started calling him the Little Bum because of his habit of always doing odd jobs and then asking for small favors in return. Perhaps because of the comedic association with his highly unusual last name, that nickname stuck for life. When his father died in 1937, Fardo dropped out of school and went to work at a local funeral home. But the fire station was always where his heart was. He became a fireman in 1942, worked his way up through the ranks, and was finally promoted to fire chief in 1964. He was now taking over a 4-truck, 40-man department that had fascinated him his entire life. Fardo didn't waste time once he had the top job. He modernized the department, outfitting his men with improved bunker coats, the latest gas masks, and self-contained breathing tanks. He introduced fire prevention education, implemented training incentives, and created service award pins for his firefighters. He was universally seen as a competent chief who was able to manage the department well. A profile in the Miami Herald described him as a restless, excessively alert man who didn't seem natural sitting behind a desk. By all accounts, he was a beloved community figure on an island where earning genuine respect wasn't easy. But Farto was also a showman. He was frequently seen cruising around Key West in a lime green Ford Galaxy 500 with mirrored tint and chrome hubcaps. The words El Jefe were also displayed on the vehicle, in what was believed to be a nod to his Spanish ancestry. However, given the business he would eventually get himself tied up in, this was one of the facts the media and prosecutors trotted out to make him out to be a kingpin. Also, just as a quick aside, as I was editing, I realized that I didn't mention what this name means in English. It's the chief. Perhaps like a fire chief. Perhaps like something a bit more. Notably, Fardo's car wasn't the only thing that set him apart from the other residents of Key West. His style was quite unique, to say the least. He favored bright red leisure suits, rose-tinted glasses, gold jewelry, and large cigars, and his office at the station was decorated with pictures of his hero, John F. Kennedy. He was, in every sense, a larger-than-life character, and that flamboyance would eventually become part of the mythology that followed his downfall. By the late 1960s and early 70s, Key West had developed a remarkably casual attitude toward the drug trade. Coke and weed flowed through the island with little interference. Dealers operated more or less openly. The general feeling among many residents was that the illicit business was simply another part of the local economy. One detective was quoted at the time as saying coke was about as common as key lime pie, but Florida Governor Reuben Askew wasn't as relaxed about it. When reports of Key West's freewheeling drug culture reached him, he ordered an investigation. The result was Operation Conch, a joint undercover sting involving multiple federal and state agencies. At the center of the operation was an informant named Titus Walters, a local who knew Fardo personally. Walters introduced Fardo to an undercover agent named Larry Dollar, claiming Dollar was his cousin. Dollar offered Fardo a gold diamond ring in exchange for an ounce of Colombian confetti. Fardo agreed, but struggled to source the product, at one point handing over a bag of weed as a gesture of goodwill. This, of course, should perhaps have been the first sign that El Jefe wasn't quite the major player some thought he was. He eventually came through, delivering coke to Dollar at a Key West fire station, where another agent secretly photographed the exchange. The situation took a grim turn before the arrests even came. Titus Walters was found dead in his bathtub, shot twice in the head. Disturbingly, he had also been injected with a hot shot heavily laced with drain cleaner, a poison that may not have finished him off quick enough. Despite this, the operation moved forward. On September 9th, 1975, 28 agents descended on Key West, posing as karate enthusiasts in town for a tournament. Also right here, I have to question why there hasn't been a Netflix series on this operation yet, since this is just pure cinema. They fanned out in unmarked cars and began making arrests. Fardo was the first one taken into custody, grabbed outside his home. Among those also arrested were Manny James, the city attorney and son of the police chief, and several other prominent figures. A crowd of roughly 200 people gathered outside the Monroe County Courthouse to watch suspects being brought in. Some onlookers reportedly applauded the agents, though others believed that the cheers were actually for the arrested men and not law enforcement. Farto was released on $25,000 bail, posted by a fellow defendant. His trial came in early February 1976, and it didn't go well for him. A jury convicted him of 1 count of selling weed and 2 counts of selling coke, after just 30 minutes of deliberation. He was looking at a prison sentence of up to 31 years. For a 56-year-old man who'd spent his entire adult life on the small island, that was essentially the end of his life as he knew it. Notably, while the media made Bum Fardo out to be a kingpin at the time, there's very little evidence that he was anything more than a minor player. It's worth noting that Farto had difficulty even obtaining coke for the undercover agent during the sting, which doesn't exactly paint the picture of a major swinger in the industry. Days after his conviction, Fardo told his wife that he needed to take care of some business in Miami. His city vehicle had been confiscated, so he rented a Pontiac sedan and drove north on U.S. Route 1, the only road connecting Key West to the mainland. That was February 16th, 1976. A few weeks later, the rental car was found abandoned in Miami. There was no sign of Bum Farto. He'd jumped his bail and vanished. The disappearance immediately became the talk of the island, and the t-shirts appeared almost right away, and one shop reportedly sold over 800 of them. The theories about what happened to Bum Farto have ranged from the plausible to the conspiratorial. The most widely discussed possibility is that he fled the country and settled in Central or South America. This theory gained some traction in 1980 when reports surfaced that Farto had been spotted at the U.S. Embassy in Costa Rica. 6 residents of the town of Golfito claimed they recognized him, and authorities believed he may have lived there until around 1979, when American fugitives began being expelled. However, none of these accounts were confirmed, and the trail went cold, if there was ever a meaningful trail to begin with. Notably, others have suggested that he'd fled to Spain, given that he was fluent in the language, and his parents were from the country. That said, there's no evidence to support this, but if he did, in 1976, Spain was in a period of political turmoil, and he may have been able to simply blend in. Others believed Farto met a grimmer end. Some locals were convinced that dealers had eliminated him to keep him quiet, possibly dumping his body in the ocean. He was functionally facing spending the rest of his life in prison, a big step down from being one of the most respected people in Key West. Ultimately, there's no proof that he ever cooperated with the authorities or sought out a deal. However, as with other cases like this, it's important to remember that there doesn't actually have to be any deal in place. He may have simply been seen as someone who could be a liability in the future, especially given his connections to law enforcement. In 1986, a decade after the disappearance, Bum Farto was declared legally dead so that his wife could collect his pension and settle his estate. Notably, his wife received less than $10,000 from his estate, which again suggests that he likely wasn't a heavy hitter in the trafficking game. That said, it's of course possible that he was able to get his money out of the country, perhaps to Costa Rica or Spain, where he lived out the remainder of his life quietly. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to subscribe to my channel if you're enjoying this video. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership to take your support for my channel to the next level. Sometimes the most consequential moments in history begin with something absurdly small. For Bogdan Stashinsky, the event that would reshape his entire life was getting caught riding a train without a ticket. Born on November 4th, 1931, in the village of Borshovichi near Lviv in western Ukraine, Stashinsky grew up in a family with deep ties to the Ukrainian nationalist movement. His three sisters were active members of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, an organization fiercely opposed to Soviet rule. The region itself was a hotbed of resistance, having been absorbed into the Soviet Union against the will of much of the local population. In 1950, the 19-year-old Stashinsky was arrested by Soviet authorities for the minor infraction of traveling without a valid transit ticket. It should have been a forgettable moment. Instead, the secret police recognized an opportunity. They knew about his family's nationalist connections, and they leveraged that knowledge ruthlessly, threatening to arrest his relatives unless he agreed to cooperate as an informant. Faced with the potential destruction of his family, Stashinsky agreed. Through his sisters, he began infiltrating Ukrainian nationalist networks. His work proved effective enough that by 1952, he was formally recruited into Soviet intelligence and sent to Kyiv for espionage training. The quiet student from a small Ukrainian village was being transformed into something far more dangerous. By 1954, Stashinsky had been deployed to East Germany under the alias Joseph Lehmann, where he perfected his German and began operating within this volatile theater. His aptitude for languages and his ability to blend into foreign environments made him an ideal candidate for the kind of work Moscow had in mind. From 1956 onward, he traveled frequently to Munich in West Germany, a city that had become a hub for Ukrainian nationalist exiles and a thorn in the Kremlin's side. In 1957, the KGB trained Stashinsky in the use of a highly specialized weapon. It was a compact spray device, roughly the size of a small tube, that crushed a glass ampule containing liquid hydrogen cyanide and expelled the poison as a fine aerosol mist. When sprayed directly into a target's face, the cyanide vapor caused almost immediate cardiac arrest. The beauty of the weapon, from the perspective of intelligence at least, was that it left virtually no trace. Deaths would appear natural, and autopsies would reveal nothing suspicious, and with instructions from Moscow, he tested the weapon on shelter dogs he acquired. This weapon proved highly effective, and the supposedly rescued dogs were dead almost instantly. With this field testing having proved successful, he received word that he was to seek out human targets. His first target was Lev Rebet, an intellectual leader within the Ukrainian exile community and the editor of several nationalist publications in Munich. On October 12, 1957, Bogdan intercepted Rebet on a staircase in the office building where the exile worked. He raised the device, sprayed the mist into Rebet's face, and walked away. Rebet collapsed and died almost instantly. An autopsy concluded he had suffered a heart attack and nobody suspected foul play. Emboldened by this success, Moscow turned Stashinsky's attention to a far bigger target, Stepan Bandera. Bandera was the most prominent figure in the Ukrainian nationalist movement in exile, a man who remained a polarizing symbol of resistance to Soviet authority. Unlike Rebet, Bandera lived under a false identity and took significant precautions for his safety. Reaching him would require patience. On October 15, 1959, Stashinsky followed Bandera to his apartment building in Munich. As Bandera struggled with his door lock, Stashinsky approached and casually asked if the key was giving him trouble. When Bandera looked up to respond, Stashinsky fired an improved version of the poison spray weapon directly into his face. Bandera collapsed in the stairwell and died shortly afterward. Once again, the initial investigation failed to identify the true cause of death. For this operation, Stashinsky was summoned to Moscow and personally awarded the Order of the Red Banner by the KGB chairman, one of the Soviet Union's highest state honors. The axe had been approved at the very top, with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev directly authorizing the attacks. Stashinsky was then given a third assignment: the elimination of Yaroslav Stetsko, another leading anti-Soviet Ukrainian figure living in Munich. That operation was planned for 1960, but for reasons that have never been fully clarified, it was never carried out. The unraveling of Bogdan Stashinsky's career as a Soviet assassin didn't begin with a crisis of ideology. It began with a woman. In 1957, while stationed in East Germany, he met and fell in love with Inga Pohl, an East German woman who, in a twist of deep irony, held strongly anti-communist views. His handlers were alarmed and attempted to discourage the relationship, but Bogdan said that if he couldn't be with her, he'd have no reason to live anymore. At first this didn't work, but Stashinsky persisted. They reluctantly allowed the marriage on the condition that Pohl would become a Soviet citizen and cooperate with intelligence. The couple settled in Moscow, where their apartment was promptly bugged. The KGB overheard them expressing anti-Soviet sentiments, deepening the agency's suspicion that Stashinsky had become a liability. When Stashinsky confided in his wife about the true nature of his work, Pohl was horrified. She, of course, knew that he was an intelligence agent, but she didn't realize what exactly he was doing in the course of his work. She helped Stashinsky see what he did wasn't as acts of service to the state, but as the elimination of real human beings with families and lives of their own. For the Soviets, this was their worst fear come true, as she was undoing all of his training and conditioning that made it easy for him to commit these horrific acts. The KGB refused to let the couple travel abroad together, fearing exactly the kind of defection that was now taking shape in Stashinsky's mind. Then tragedy struck. In early 1961, Inga returned to East Germany to give birth to their son, Peter. Stashinsky was forced to remain in Moscow. At just 4 months old, Peter suddenly developed a fever and died in a German hospital. The KGB, perhaps calculating that grief would make Stashinsky easier to control, allowed him to travel to East Berlin for the funeral. It was the last mistake they'd make with him. On August 12, 1961, one day before their son's funeral and literal hours before the Berlin Wall began to go up, Stashinsky and his wife slipped away from their handlers. They took a long route intentionally designed to throw off anyone who may have been tailing them. Ultimately, they arrived at a small town on the outskirts of Berlin and took a taxi to East Berlin, where they subsequently crossed the border. Stashinsky then walked into a local police station, announced that he was a KGB agent, confessed to 2 political assassinations, and asked to be arrested. The local cops were clearly in over their heads, and through a series of handovers, he eventually found his way into the hands of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA was initially skeptical of Stashinsky's claims, and it took extensive interrogation before his story was accepted as credible. He was turned over to West German authorities and put on trial in October 1962 at the federal court in Karlsruhe. The proceedings became one of the most sensational espionage cases of the era, drawing global media attention. Stashinsky's detailed testimony exposed the program and directly implicated Khrushchev in ordering the slayings. The court determined that while Stashinsky had physically committed the acts against the two men, the primary guilt lay with the Soviet leadership that had directed them. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but, with credit for good behavior, served approximately 4 years before his release in 1966. Notably, it's widely believed that he was given a much lighter sentence due to the sensitive intelligence information he handed over. While there's no direct evidence that this occurred, I'm going to go ahead and say that given what he knew, especially about the weapon he used, I feel extremely confident this was the case. Inga Pol divorced Stashinsky in 1964 while he was still incarcerated, having difficulty accepting the evil acts he had committed. She either changed her name or was granted an entirely new identity and ended up completely disappearing from the historical record. After his release, Stashinsky himself vanished just as thoroughly, and the details of what happened next remain murky and contested. According to one account, he was flown out of Germany on a U.S. Air Force plane and taken to America under official government protection. Given his ability to adopt new identities and mimic the accents and mannerisms of the people around him, it's likely he could have stayed undetected. Notably, he already had the ability to pass himself off as a German so convincingly that he lived incognito in Germany. If he turned up in Michigan or California and claimed to be an immigrant from Germany, it's highly unlikely he would have raised any red flags. As of today, nobody can say with certainty where Bogdan Stashinsky ended up, or whether the man who once carried the KGB's most secretive weapon is still alive. Born in 1931, he would be in his 90s if he survived, and bizarrely, there's a real possibility that this Soviet hitman is currently living in a retirement community in Florida. On the evening of August 15, 1977, a volunteer astronomer named Jerry Eman sat down at his kitchen table with a stack of printouts from Ohio State University's Big Ear radio telescope. What he found buried in columns of letters and numbers would become the most famous signal in the history of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Scrawled in red ink, Eman wrote a single unfiltered reaction in the margin. He wrote the word, "Wow." It was an instinctive, unfiltered reaction to something that shouldn't have been there, and nearly 5 decades later, that exclamation still captures the wonder the signal inspires. The wow signal, as it came to be known, lasted approximately 72 seconds. It has never been detected again. Despite the best efforts of scientists around the world, no one has been able to definitively explain what caused it. To understand the significance of the wow signal, you first need to understand the instrument that detected it and the project it served. The Big Ear radio telescope was a flat, football field-sized reflector located at Ohio State University's Perkins Observatory site, about 20 miles outside Columbus. It used a ground-level aluminum reflector that bounced incoming radio waves up to a secondary reflector, which then directed them to a receiver horn. The design was unconventional but effective, and it had been operating since the 1960s, initially for systematically mapping radio sources across the sky. By the early 1970s, Big Ear had been enlisted in a project called the Ohio Sky Survey. This was part of a broader effort affiliated with the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, commonly known as SETI. The telescope scanned the sky passively as the Earth rotated, recording whatever radio emissions it happened to pick up along a narrow strip of sky. The data it produced was processed by a mainframe computer and printed out on continuous feed paper, generating columns of alphanumeric characters. Each character represented the signal intensity in a particular frequency channel over a short interval of time. The scale ran from 1 through 9 and then continued with the letters A through Z for higher intensities, with a space representing background noise. It was, by modern standards, an incredibly crude system, but it was doing real science on what was essentially a shoestring budget. The WOW signal had a rise and fall pattern that's exactly what one would expect from a narrowband signal being swept across by a fixed antenna as the Earth rotates. However, its peak intensity was somewhere between 25 and 30 times more significant than the normal background noise in the region. The signal appeared to come from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, near the Chi Sagittarii star group. Notably, no star or other known astronomical object in that region has ever been identified as a plausible source. Critically, the WOW signal was detected at a frequency very close to 1,420 MHz, the emission line of neutral hydrogen. This frequency has long been considered a natural candidate for interstellar communication because hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. As early as 1959, scientists argued that any civilization attempting to broadcast its presence across the galaxy might choose this frequency precisely because it's universally recognizable. The fact that the WOW signal appeared so close to this theoretically significant frequency added an extra layer of intrigue to what was already an extraordinary detection. In the days, weeks, and years following the detection, astronomers pointed every available instrument at the same patch of sky. Eamon himself returned to the data repeatedly, and the Big Ear continued to scan the region as part of its normal operations. Robert Dixon, the director of the SETI program at Ohio State, coordinated repeated attempts to find the signal again. Other observatories, including the Very Large Array in New Mexico and the Oak Ridge Observatory in Massachusetts, also conducted targeted searches of the area. None of them ever detected anything resembling the original signal. This failure to replicate is one of the most important and frustrating aspects of the WOW signal. Notably, in science, a single unrepeated observation is enormously difficult to work with, especially when it stands so far outside what is expected. You can't rule out instrument error, terrestrial interference, or some other mundane explanation without being able to observe the phenomenon again under controlled conditions. One of the earliest hypotheses was that the signal might have been caused by a satellite or piece of space debris reflecting an Earth-based transmission back toward the telescope. However, detailed analyses of the data and observation geometry largely ruled this out. The frequency was protected by an international agreement for radio astronomy, meaning no terrestrial transmitter should have been broadcasting at that level. Additionally, no known satellite was in the right position at the right time. For decades, the WOW signal remained essentially unexplained, a one-off anomaly that defied easy categorization. Then, in 2017, an astronomer named Antonio Paris published a paper proposing that the signal could have been generated by hydrogen emission from one of two comets. Paris argued that under certain conditions, a comet's hydrogen cloud could produce a detectable signal near the 1,420 MHz line. The comet hypothesis attracted significant media attention, with many outlets reporting it as though the mystery had been conclusively solved. However, the scientific community's reception was considerably more skeptical. Several researchers pointed out serious problems with the proposal. The comets in question were too faint and too far from the Sun in 1977 to produce a hydrogen cloud of the necessary size and density. Additionally, the signal's narrowband characteristics didn't match what scientists would expect from a diffuse comet emission, which would be spread across a broader range of frequencies. Scientists have since moved on from this hypothesis, though it remains a popular talking point amongst people who believe the mystery has been solved. It's worth being precise about what the WOW signal tells us and what it doesn't. It tells us that on one occasion, a strong narrowband radio signal was detected at a scientifically significant frequency from a direction in the sky where no obvious natural source exists. It doesn't tell us that aliens were trying to communicate with Earth. The leap from an unexplained signal to extraterrestrial intelligence is enormous. Eamon himself, despite his obvious excitement in the moment, consistently cautioned against overinterpreting the detection. He spent years analyzing the data and repeatedly stated that he didn't know what caused the signal, only that it matched what you'd expect from an extraterrestrial source. But he clarified that it only matched better than any other explanation he could think of, and this didn't mean a better explanation didn't exist. Regardless of its ultimate explanation, the WOW signal has had a profound impact on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and on public imagination. It demonstrated that even with fairly modest equipment and highly limited funding, research could produce genuinely compelling results. It gave the field a concrete, tangible artifact to point to when making the case for continued funding, public attention, and institutional support. The Big Ear telescope itself didn't survive to continue the search for life in outer space. Despite a long campaign by scientists and the public to preserve it, the telescope was demolished in 1998 to make way for a golf course and a housing development. As for my take on what it was, as I've said before, and I'm sure I'll say again, to quote Fox Mulder, I want to believe. On the afternoon of July 8, 1997, a 16-year-old girl named Natasha Jennings was found dead on the floor of a bedroom in her aunt's apartment in Carson City, Nevada. She'd been visiting from Southern California, spending part of her summer with her father, Clarence Jennings, and her aunt Sandra. By all accounts, Natasha was a bright, sociable teenager who cared deeply about her family and wasn't mixed up in trouble. She was supposed to meet her father that afternoon. She never showed up. When Clarence couldn't reach her, he called Sandra and asked her to check on his daughter. Sandra went upstairs and found Natasha lying motionless on the guest room floor. An electric fan was resting on top of her body, and her hair was damp, as though she'd recently bathed. Paramedics arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Natasha was already dead. She was just 16 years old, and what happened to her in that room remains one of Nevada's most confounding unsolved cases nearly 3 decades later. From the moment investigators arrived at the apartment, nothing about the scene made straightforward sense. There were no obvious signs of trauma on Natasha's body. No bruises, no wounds, nothing that pointed immediately to an attack. The damp hair suggested she might have showered or bathed shortly before she died, and the overturned electric fan on her body was peculiar. The Carson City Sheriff's Department launched an investigation, and Natasha's body was sent for an autopsy. The results only deepened the mystery. The medical examiner couldn't determine a definitive cause of death. There was no evidence of strangulation, blunt force trauma, or any of the typical indicators you'd expect. However, investigators did find something troubling near the bedroom, a small piece of plastic that tested positive for traces of meth and coke. An examination of Natasha's body also revealed a minute amount of drug residue inside her nostrils. This detail became a focal point of the investigation, but it came with a significant caveat. When toxicology screens were run on Natasha's blood, no drugs were detected in her system. The residue was on her, but apparently not inside her. A very odd situation that has never been meaningfully explained. It was almost as if someone had staged the scene to imply that something had happened, and hoped that investigators wouldn't dig any further. Over the weeks and months that followed, three primary theories emerged about what might have happened to Natasha. The first involved a young Carson City man known publicly only as Chris. During her visit, Natasha had attended a party where alcohol was being consumed. In the days after that gathering, Natasha reportedly told her best friend back in California that she'd blacked out during the party and that Chris had indecently assaulted her. Police interrogated Chris, but they didn't believe the allegation, and the autopsy concluded there was no physical evidence of assault. Chris denied any involvement in Natasha's death, and investigators ultimately didn't pursue him as a suspect. Still, the timing of these allegations, coming just days before Natasha died, has struck many observers as deeply unsettling. The second theory centered on Natasha's father and his alleged ties to law enforcement. After Natasha's death, her mother, Tammy Stelton, traveled to Carson City and began her own investigation. She distributed flyers around the city seeking information. During this effort, a woman approached Tammy at a shopping center and made a claim. She said that Clarence Jennings had been working as a confidential informant for local police and had been involved in shutting down some dealers. According to this woman, these local dealers had discovered Clarence's role and slain Natasha as an act of retaliation. While this was presented to Tammy as a factual scenario, it remained unclear if this was just grist from the rumor mill or whether there was something substantial behind these claims. The Nevada Division of Investigators stated that Clarence was never a documented informant, and Clarence himself expressed shock at the accusation. However, Tammy later claimed that an investigator privately confirmed to her that Clarence had indeed been an informant, creating a contradiction that's never been resolved. Whether or not this theory holds water, the conflicting statements from official channels and back channels didn't do much to build trust with Natasha's family. The third theory came from renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht, who reviewed the case independently. Dr. Wecht proposed that Natasha may have ingested drugs at some point during her visit, and subsequently developed hyperthermia, a dangerous overheating of the body. In this scenario, Natasha would have taken a bath to try to cool herself down, and then suffered a fatal spasm or seizure while drying off. This could potentially explain the damp hair and the fan found on her body. It's a theory that accounts for the physical evidence at the scene, but it relies on the assumption that Natasha used substances. Her mother has consistently and firmly maintained that her daughter didn't use drugs. While I don't put great stock in her mom not knowing this, her friends also appear to have confirmed to investigators that she never touched the stuff. Further yet, the absence of any substances in her bloodstream makes the overdose angle difficult to support with confidence, at least in my view. What followed Natasha's death was years of frustration for her family, particularly for Tammy Stelton. Tammy felt that the investigation had been mishandled from the start, and that Carson City officials were either incompetent or deliberately withholding information. She complained that the district attorney spoke with her directly only once, shortly after Natasha's death, and then failed to respond to multiple written inquiries. In 1999, her attorney filed a petition in Carson District Court on Tammy's behalf, seeking to convene a grand jury to investigate her daughter's death. The petition was denied. Tammy appealed to the Nevada Supreme Court, but the court rejected the effort as well, siding with authorities who maintained that the investigation had been fair and thorough. However, eventually, after further protests, the Nevada Division of Investigation reviewed the case at the district attorney's request and concluded that nothing more could be found. The district attorney acknowledged that the death was mysterious, but maintained there was no indication that formal proceedings would uncover new information. In August 2008, Clarence Jennings died after what's been described as the brutal aftermath of an attempt to voluntarily pull the curtains on his life. He reportedly left a note, was found and placed on life support, and ultimately passed away, preventing any more investigation about what he knew. Whether his death was connected to a sense of guilt or grief or unrelated personal struggles is unknown, but it removed a central figure from the case. Notably, Natasha's case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in an episode that first aired on August 15, 2001, bringing national attention to the mystery. While the show was well past its cultural zenith at that point, this led to millions of people being exposed to the mystery surrounding her passing. Despite this, no new material leads were generated, and as of now, Natasha's case is no closer to being solved than it was on the day she was found. Ultimately, something happened to Natasha Jennings in that apartment, and whatever it was, the truth has proven stubbornly resistant to discovery. November 11th, 1995 started as a fairly ordinary Saturday for Carolyn Killaby, a woman who had a long history of marital troubles. The 34-year-old medical technician from Vancouver, Washington, had been in a 2-day argument with her husband Dan over his drinking, putting a serious strain on their marriage. By that morning, though, they'd patched things up and made plans for a romantic dinner together, the kind of gesture couples use to reset after a rough patch. Dan went off to work, but when his brother called him as he was finishing his shift and invited him for drinks, he made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He and his brother drank late into the night, and at around 1 that morning, he called home and left a message saying he wasn't coming back that evening. Carolyn, left alone with a canceled dinner and a husband who'd chosen a bar over their reconciliation, did what a lot of people might do and left the house. She drove to Omar's Steakhouse and Lounge on Northeast 4th Plain Road in the Orchards area, but despite being a steakhouse, Omar's wasn't exactly upscale. The place had earned itself the local nickname of Snowmars due to its reputation for coke. It was, in spite of or because of this, a popular spot, busy on weekends, and Carolyn sat alone at a table, visibly upset. Multiple witnesses observed her crying at points, dancing occasionally, and drinking heavily over the course of the evening. By the time the night was ending, witnesses noted that she was extremely intoxicated. What happened next has been the subject to significant debate, but what is clear is that she never made it home. Among the people in Omar's that night was a man named Dennis Smith. He'd been watching Carolyn throughout the evening. At some point before the bar closed, he reportedly commented to the bouncer that she was going to find herself in trouble before the night was out. It was a remark that would later take on a deeply sinister meaning. Around 11:30 that night, Smith approached Carolyn. A witness described him essentially steering her toward the exit, with her apparently too intoxicated to fully understand what was happening. The two left the bar together, and that was the last time anyone ever saw her. What happened next is murky, and Smith's account never quite added up. He told investigators he'd been helping a very drunk Carolyn to her car when an unknown man appeared, confronted them aggressively, and then left with her. Smith claimed he drove away and had nothing more to do with it, and nobody ever identified this mystery stranger. Nobody ever corroborated the story, and just before midnight, 2 separate individuals called 911 to report hearing a woman screaming for help near the area. The calls were logged, but given that this was a rough area and this wasn't unusual, nothing was done about them that night. When Dan Killaby came home the next morning and found Carolyn absent, he didn't immediately panic. He assumed at first that she was punishing him for not coming home, staying somewhere else to make a point. But when she failed to show up for her job the following morning, something completely out of character, the alarm bells started ringing. he and his brother began driving around Vancouver looking for her. On November 13th, Dan found her 1991 Toyota Camry sitting in the parking lot at Omar's. Inside, there was a handwritten note about wanting to fly from Portland to Los Angeles. Investigators in the family couldn't fully explain this note, but didn't treat it as evidence she'd simply left on her own. Dan stated unequivocally that it wasn't like Carolyn to vanish without telling anyone. Her family backed him up. Friends confirmed she didn't have a habit of heavy drinking, and the circumstances felt wrong. But it wasn't until the investigation took shape that the full picture of who Dennis Smith really was began to emerge, and it was deeply alarming to say the least. Smith's criminal history stretched back into his youth, and these weren't your typical crimes associated with wayward young adults. And trust me, I'm putting it mildly. His most serious conviction involved the 1982 slaying of his own sister, Patricia Johnson. He'd served roughly 10 years of a life sentence before being paroled in 1993, and the parole board itself had documented concerns. In 1992, the board wrote that it was evident Smith absolutely couldn't consume alcohol or drugs without posing a clear risk to public safety. And yet, by the time of Carolyn's disappearance, he'd been discharged from drug monitoring after 6 months of clean tests. He was, on paper, supervised. However, records later revealed he'd committed at least 25 parole violations that authorities had failed to properly act on. His wife had even sent a letter to the Department of Corrections warning that he was a dangerous psychopath, but it went unheeded. As it turns out, it was Carolyn's case that brought Smith to public attention in a new way, and the public became acutely aware of the monster in their midst. Patricia's son, Dustin, who was 5 years old when his mother was slain by his own uncle, had been living with his grandparents in the same household as Smith. When Dustin read about Carolyn's disappearance in the newspaper and saw that a man named Dennis had been seen with her, he put it together immediately. He called Dan Killaby and shared his suspicion. Dan passed the information to detectives, and investigators confirmed that the Dennis in question was indeed Dennis Smith. And no, you don't have to replay that to make sure you heard that correctly. Dustin was forced to live with the man who had killed his own mother. Smith maintained his story about the mysterious stranger in the parking lot, and later claimed he'd had consensual contact with Carolyn earlier that evening. He claimed that would explain any biological evidence linking them, but detectives didn't buy it. When they searched his truck, they found the passenger seat's cover had been removed, along with the upholstery and carpeting. A large burned hole had been made in the seat, which Smith attributed to a cigarette. While nothing was adding up, at that stage, they didn't have enough to hold him, so they released him and kept investigating. Within 2 weeks of Carolyn's disappearance, Smith vanished. He fled the state and remained a fugitive for over a year. In the meantime, forensic work continued, and DNA analysis of blood traces found in Smith's truck matched Carolyn's profile. That evidence, combined with the broader investigation, was finally enough to clap this sick puppy in cuffs. In July 1996, Smith was charged with her slaying, yet he was still nowhere to be found. Then, on January 31st, 1997, a fugitive segment about Smith aired on Unsolved Mysteries. Astonishingly, Smith reportedly watched the episode with friends. Days later, on February 4th, 1997, he was pulled over by police in Florida while driving a stolen vehicle. When he went for the officer's gun during the stop, he was shot and critically wounded. He survived, recovered, and was extradited back to Washington to stand trial. The trial was contentious, and Smith's defense team pushed back hard on the DNA evidence, arguing the blood was consistent with a consensual encounter rather than violence. They also attempted to point the jury toward Dan Killaby as an alternative suspect, citing the couple's marital tensions. They pointed out that the couple were routinely fighting about Dan's drinking habits, and on the night in question, he went out boozing. The jury wasn't convinced and convicted Smith, accepting the prosecution's claim that he had slain Carolyn after abducting her that night. Since he was on probation, any serious offense such as this was the equivalent of a life sentence regardless, so this monster simply eliminated her. Combined with a 99-year sentence that was reinstated for the crime against his sister, he was sentenced to life with no possibility of parole. In 2002, the state of Washington settled a wrongful death lawsuit brought by Carolyn's family for $2.8 million. The state acknowledged that Smith had been inadequately supervised while on parole, despite documented red flags. The settlement was a form of accountability, but it wasn't the closure the family was searching for, and Carolyn's body had never been found. Perhaps since he had exhausted all his appeals, Smith eventually admitted to the crimes against Carolyn. In June 2004, he attempted to lead authorities to her remains, claiming she was buried out on Larch Mountain, but a search was conducted and nothing was found. And then, just a few months later, Dennis Smith decided to pull the curtains on his life of violence. He was found dead in his prison cell in November 2004, taking whatever he knew about Carolyn's final resting place to the grave with him. So probably much like you, I can't get past the infuriating reality of this case and why this man was ever released in the first place. We're not talking about some petty offender who made a bad decision in his younger years. Dennis Smith strangled his own sister. This may come as a shock to the parole board that released him, but that's not a gray area crime. They documented that he couldn't drink or use drugs without posing a clear threat to public safety, and yet he was paroled anyway. Then he racks up at least 25 violations, and nothing meaningful happens regardless of this. His own wife even warns authorities that he's a dangerous psychopath, and it's ignored. The warning signs were everywhere, flashing red, and still the system failed to act. Carolyn Killaby didn't just disappear because of one disturbed predator that no one could have predicted would strike. She vanished because a system signed off on him, looked at his history, saw the risk, and chose to gamble on the release of an ultra-high-risk offender. Hood River, Oregon, sits about 60 miles east of Portland in the Columbia River Gorge. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where orchard families have worked the same land for generations, and where serious crime is almost unheard of. But in the summer of 2001, this quiet community was shaken by an event that would expose bizarre investigative decisions and tangled personal relationships. The victim was Eric Tamiyasu, a 41-year-old third-generation fruit farmer whose family roots in the area stretched back nearly a century. His death wasn't just a tragedy for the people who knew him. It was the beginning of a mystery that Hood River has never been able to solve. The Tamiyasu family's story in America began in 1906, when Eric's grandfather Gunichi left his farming family in Japan and boarded a ship bound for San Francisco. He eventually made his way to Oregon, laying railroad track before falling in love with the Hood River Valley. He leased land and started growing fruit, and within a few years he had a successful farming operation. Then came 1942, and the Tamiyasu family, like so many Japanese-American families on the West Coast, was forcibly relocated to an internment camp. When they returned after the conflict was over, they found their orchards overgrown, their equipment stolen, and every window in their home smashed. Despite all of that, the family rebuilt and persevered. By the time Eric took over operations decades later, the Tamiyasu orchard was again a well-established fruit-growing business. Eric had recently built a new home right next to the orchard, a place he'd constructed with his own hands. He was single, well-liked, and by all accounts living a peaceful life with no known enemies. On the evening of June 25th, 2001, Eric invited his longtime friend Diana Anderson over to his house. The two had been close for years, but had recently developed romantic feelings for each other, and this was essentially their first official date. According to Diana's later recollections, the evening took an unsettling turn. While they were together at the house, they heard someone tapping on the windows. The doorbell rang twice, and both times, when Eric went to check, no one was there. He reportedly heard footsteps running down the driveway, but couldn't see anyone in the darkness. A single shoe print was found in the dirt near the front door. Diana left a few hours later, shaken but safe. It was the last time anyone is known to have seen Eric Tamiyasu alive. Over the following days, Eric went completely silent. He didn't answer his phone or show up to handle business. Friends began reaching out to one another, asking if anyone had heard from him. After roughly 5 days of silence, Don Dixon, a man who described himself as one of Eric's closest friends and his business consultant, drove out to the remote property. Using a spare key he said Eric had given him, Dixon entered the house, and the smell, the deep stench of decay, hit him immediately. Upstairs, he found Eric's badly decomposed body lying on the bed, and he immediately called the police. When Hood River County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they found no signs of forced entry, no indication of robbery, and no obvious evidence of violence on the body. The advanced decomposition had obscured any visible wounds, and investigators initially believed Eric had died of natural causes, perhaps a sudden cardiac arrest. Then came a truly bizarre decision that would haunt this case for decades. After Eric's body was removed, County Sheriff Joe Wampler asked Dixon to help burn the soiled mattress and bedding. Wampler's stated reasoning was that he wanted to spare the Tamiyasu family the grief of encountering the aftermath of decomposition. Dixon complied, and nothing remained of the mattress but the steel frame. That same day, the Oregon State Medical Examiner completed the autopsy and made a shocking discovery, determining that Eric hadn't died of natural causes at all. He'd been shot 3 times in the back of the head while he slept. The bullets had been lodged inside his skull, and the decomposition had completely hidden the entry wounds. This strange and chilling decision to burn the mattress cast a long shadow over the entire investigation and over Sheriff Wampler himself. The investigation identified 3 persons of interest, with the first, of course, being Sheriff Wampler, who had ordered key evidence destroyed. Beyond the questionable decision to destroy the bed, rumors circulated that Eric had been involved with Wampler's wife. Don Dixon claimed that shortly before his death, Eric told him he was dating a Polynesian woman, a description matching the sheriff's wife. However, he didn't know any further details about this woman beyond her ethnic background. If true, this would have given Wampler a personal motive. Wampler denied the affair, denied any involvement, and passed a polygraph administered by his own department. The second suspect was Eric Smith, one of Tamiyasu's closest friends and a business partner. Dixon claimed he'd overheard a heated argument between the 2 men in the days before the attack, alleging Tamiyasu accused Smith of theft from the business. Dixon made the claim that Smith had taken over $50,000, a number that would prove to be highly suspect. Smith, for his part, denied the argument ever happened and said neither man owed the other money. Investigators found that each had invested only around $10,000, calling into question the $50,000 figure. The third and most controversial suspect was Dixon himself. Several things raised red flags. Eric Smith and others disputed Dixon's claim of being a close friend, with Smith saying Eric had described Dixon as merely someone he bought farm supplies from. More troubling was a phone call Dixon made to Eric's sister Ramona shortly after finding the body. Dixon reportedly told her he hadn't found any exit wounds, a deeply strange remark given that the wounds hadn't been discovered yet. Dixon explained he'd assumed that Eric did it to himself, but no weapon was found at the scene and he would have known that. When it came time for polygraph tests, Dixon initially refused. He later agreed, but examiners couldn't establish a reliable baseline, and the test couldn't proceed. Despite national exposure and a private investigation funded by the Tamiyasu family, the case has never been resolved. The authorities eventually considered Diana Anderson's former boyfriend and examined theories tied to the suspicious activity reported the night Eric was slain. However, since all the critical evidence was lost early on, detectives had little ability to fully examine this line of thought. Unfortunately, given that destruction of evidence, it appears likely to me that getting a conviction in Eric's death will likely be virtually impossible regardless. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy dropping in quickly with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and share this video with your friends and family members. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to support my channel further. Bermuda's waters have claimed hundreds of ships over the centuries, so much so that the popular myth of the Bermuda Triangle still surrounds the region. The island sits in the Atlantic, surrounded by shallow coral reefs that have torn apart vessels since the earliest days of European exploration. It's a graveyard, and the remains of those ships have sat on the ocean floor for hundreds of years, waiting for someone curious enough to go looking. In 1955, that someone was a 30-year-old Bermudan diver named Edward Tucker, known to everyone as Teddy. Tucker wasn't some weekend hobbyist. He'd been obsessed with the ocean since childhood, growing up close to Hamilton Harbor. He'd worked at the Bermuda Aquarium as a boy, served as an underwater demolitions expert for the Royal Navy, and returned home to build a life around the sea. By the mid-1950s, he was one of the most experienced divers on the island, regularly exploring the wrecks that littered the reef platform. On a September day in 1955, Tucker was diving at a site he believed to be the wreck of the San Pedro, a Spanish galleon thought to have gone down in the 1590s. He'd already pulled up coins, gold bars, and various other treasures over several dives. Then, roughly 30 feet below the surface, Tucker lifted a heavy plank of wood and found something extraordinary lying face down in the sand. It was a cross, and when he turned it over, 7 large green emeralds caught the light. The piece was made of 22-karat gold, measured about 3 inches by 1.5 inches. It featured tiny gold nails hanging from rings on its arms, likely representing the nails of the crucifixion. The emeralds were cut in a style dating back to the Middle Ages, and the craftsmanship, while beautiful, appeared to be the work of New World artisans rather than jewelers from Spain. The cross also had a removable back, concealing a small, empty cavity, presumably once used to house a sacred relic. It was, at the time, considered one of the most valuable single objects ever recovered from a shipwreck. Tucker's discovery didn't just make him a world-famous treasure hunter. It also created an ownership dispute with the Bermudan government, which argued that the territorial seabed belonged to the British Crown. Tucker reportedly told them that if that was the case, he'd take everything back to the reef and let them search for it themselves. The government relented, and Tucker retained ownership. Despite this, Tucker wasn't interested in selling to the highest bidder. Numerous individuals and institutions put in unsolicited bids, and at one point the American ambassador to Italy sent a representative to Bermuda. That agent had simple instructions that few people could turn down: acquire the cross at any cost. Despite being told to name his price, Tucker refused to consider the offer, believing that the cross was the equivalent of the crown jewels of Bermuda. He eventually agreed to sell the entire haul from the San Pedro site to the Bermudan government for roughly £35,000. This was a fraction of the value of the cross alone, and Tucker simply wanted the money to fund further searches. The government placed the cross on public display in an aquarium of all places, where it remained safely stored for years. In February 1975, Queen Elizabeth was scheduled to visit Bermuda to survey the island. As part of the royal visit, the San Pedro treasure collection was to be transferred from the aquarium to the newly established Bermuda Maritime Museum. There it would be displayed for the Queen's inspection, and Tucker was invited to serve as a guide for the presentation. The treasures were packed up and transported to the new location, and several people handled the items as the display was arranged. Everything seemed to be in order. Then, just moments before the Queen arrived, Tucker took one last look at the display. Something about the cross bothered him. It didn't have the same weight or the same presence he so clearly remembered, so he reached out and touched it, and gold-colored paint came off on his hand. The Tucker cross had been replaced with a cheap replica, and the paint wasn't even dry. Tucker was stunned, but there was no time to raise an alarm. He quickly removed the fake and rearranged the remaining treasures. He composed himself just in time to present the collection to the Queen, as though nothing had happened. The visit went smoothly, but behind the scenes, a crisis was unfolding. The police investigation that followed revealed just how vulnerable the cross had been. The key to the safe housing the cross at the aquarium had been kept in an unlocked cabinet. The fact that the paint on the replica was still wet when Tucker discovered the switch suggested the swap had occurred in the preceding couple of days. Detectives believed it likely occurred during transit between the aquarium and the Maritime Museum. The window of opportunity was narrow but apparently sufficient. Bermuda's police force wasn't used to this sort of crime, and they called in reinforcements. The FBI, Scotland Yard, and Interpol all became involved in the investigation. Despite this international cooperation, there was almost nothing to go on. Multiple people had access to the cross during the transfer, and nobody involved admitted to knowing that a replica had been substituted. The investigation produced no arrests, no reliable leads, and no recovery of the original cross. Several theories emerged over the years, with most suspecting an inside job, though no evidence supported that claim. Others believed that the sophistication of the crime pointed to something more international, specifically the creation and use of a convincing replica rather than simply stealing the cross outright, suggested to many that the thief was likely a professional. Tucker himself believed that someone had been hired to take the cross, given the planning involved in fabricating a decoy, though he never named who he thought was responsible publicly. The Tucker cross has never been recovered, and the case remains officially unsolved more than 50 years later. What makes it even more painful is that the cross wasn't the only treasure to go missing from Bermuda's museums. In 2005, visitors to the Bermuda Maritime Museum noticed that several other items from Tucker's collection were missing from their display cases, including a gold bar and a gold chain. As with the cross, these items were never recovered either, pointing to ongoing systemic security failures on the island. On the morning of December 10, 1968, on the western outskirts of Tokyo in Fuchu, a single individual pulled off what many consider to be the most audacious robbery in Japanese history. Without firing a shot, without injuring a soul, and without ever being identified, one person managed to steal nearly 300 million yen from 4 bank employees. Adjusted for inflation, that haul would be worth somewhere in the range of $9 to $10 million today. It's the kind of crime that sounds like it belongs in a movie, and in fact, it's been turned into several. However, despite the apparently non-violent nature of this crime, it would, as I'll explain, eventually claimed the lives of 4 people. But before the decades of obsession came the crime itself, and to understand how it happened, you need to understand the Japan of the late 1960s. Japan was in the thick of its economic miracle. Companies were booming, factories were running at full capacity, and workers were being rewarded handsomely for their efforts. Twice a year, Japanese companies distributed bonuses to their employees, a tradition stretching back to the Edo period. The winter bonus, typically paid in December, was an especially significant one. For Toshiba's factory workers in Fuchu, that bonus amounted to roughly 294 million yen. On this particular December morning, 4 employees of the Nippon Trust Bank were tasked with delivering that cash by car to the Toshiba plant. The money sat in 3 metal cases in the trunk of a black Nissan sedan. It was a routine delivery in a cash-heavy economy where bank transfers weren't yet the norm for large corporate payroll distributions. What made this robbery possible wasn't just the thief's nerve. It was the groundwork that had been laid in the days and months before. Between April and August of 1968, someone had sent 9 threatening letters and extortion demands to the Tama Agricultural Co-op in the same general area. These letters demanded money and threatened bombings and arson. Then, on December 6th, just 4 days before the robbery, a branch manager received an ominous piece of mail. The letter demanded 3 million yen be delivered by a female teller to a specified location by the following afternoon, or the sender would bomb the bank and the manager's home. The bank didn't comply and instead contacted police, who dispatched around 50 undercover officers to stake out the drop-off point. The extortionist never showed, but the damage, in terms of psychological preparation, was done. The bank's employees were now primed to believe that a genuine threat existed. When the Nissan sedan set out on the morning of December 10th carrying the Toshiba bonuses, the staff inside were already on edge. Normally, only 2 employees would have accompanied such a delivery, but the recent threats had prompted the bank to double the escort. Importantly, handwriting analysis later confirmed that the threatening letters sent to the Tama Co-op and the letter sent to the bank manager were written by the same person. The Nissan was only a few hundred feet from its destination when something very unusual happened. A young man on a white police motorcycle, dressed in the uniform of a Tokyo Metropolitan Police officer, pulled alongside and signaled the car to stop. The location was a quiet stretch of road near the walls of Tokyo Fuchu Prison, a comparatively desolate location in the metropolis. The fake officer approached the vehicle and delivered a stunning piece of news that would have normally seemed unbelievable. He told the 4 bank employees that their branch manager's house had just been blown up and that police believed a bomb had been planted beneath their car as well. The employees, already anxious because of the recent threats, didn't question him, and they got out of the vehicle as fast as they could. The imposter then crawled beneath the vehicle, ostensibly to check for explosives. Moments later, smoke and flames erupted from under the car, and the employees, terrified, ran for cover. What they didn't realize was that the smoke came from a simple road flare the thief had ignited to sell the illusion. While they scrambled to safety, the fake officer calmly climbed into the driver's seat of the car and drove away with nearly 300 million yen in the trunk. The entire operation, from the moment the car was flagged down to the moment it vanished down the rain-slicked road, took roughly 3 minutes. With the proper groundwork, that's all it took to pull off the biggest robbery in Japanese history. By the time the bewildered employees gathered their wits and contacted the bank, only to learn that the manager's house was perfectly fine, the thief had already vanished. He'd driven the bank car to a secondary location where he transferred the metal cases to a stolen vehicle, then switched cars again. Multiple getaway vehicles had been arranged in advance, each one stolen beforehand and staged along the escape route. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department declared a state of emergency across the city within minutes. Checkpoints were established at intersections throughout Tokyo, and officers searched every vehicle passing through. Despite this massive and immediate response, the thief slipped through the net entirely. By the end of the day, police had to concede that their dragnet had failed. What followed was the largest criminal investigation Japan had ever seen at that point, with tens of thousands of police officers from Tokyo and across the country participating in the search. Roughly 100,000 forensic sketches were printed and distributed across the country, with the image achieving the cultural equivalence of the Unabomber sketch. The suspect list eventually ballooned to an astonishing 110,000 names. Fingerprints collected from the crime scene, the abandoned vehicles, and other evidence were painstakingly compared against 6 million prints on file, but not a single match was found. The serial numbers of every stolen banknote had been recorded, and authorities monitored banks and businesses across the nation for any sign of the money entering circulation. Despite this massive effort, curiously, none of the money ever ended up surfacing. The investigation also produced over 120 individual pieces of physical evidence recovered from the various crime scenes. This included the motorcycle that had been painted white to resemble a police vehicle, a hat, the road flare, and a magnet. Most of these items were common, simply everyday objects, and it's widely believed the thief scattered them deliberately to muddy the investigative waters. The weather that morning had also been rainy, which further hampered evidence collection and limited the reliability of witness accounts. The investigation produced several prominent suspects, though none was ever charged. The first and seemingly most compelling was a 19-year-old man known publicly only as Boy S. He was the son of a motorcycle police officer and a member of the Tachikawa Group, a local youth motorcycle gang. His familiarity with police uniforms, motorcycles, and the local area made him an obvious person of interest. He had no alibi for the morning of December 10th. Despite a publication ban on his name, both him and his father became temporarily notorious in police circles. Unfortunately, just 5 days after the robbery, on December 15th, he was found dead of potassium cyanide poisoning. Authorities ruled that he did it himself, but in a twist, they declared that he was innocent, with absolutely no evidence to connect him to the crime. Tragically, it appears that the significant attention that was placed upon him and his father had driven him to commit this act. Sadly, though, this wouldn't be the only tragedy connected to a false accusation in this case. A year later, in December 1969, the Mainichi Shimbun newspaper publicly identified a 26-year-old man as a suspect. Police arrested him on an unrelated charge as a pretext to interrogate him about the robbery. It turned out he had an airtight alibi since he'd been sitting a proctored examination at the time of the heist. The arresting officer was subsequently charged in relation to this bad faith arrest, accused of putting closing the case above getting to the truth. Disturbingly, the suspect's life was destroyed. His reputation was shattered. His family went bankrupt defending him, and he eventually chose to end it all over the accusation. Notably, 2 police officers involved in the investigation took the same route during the course of the investigation, also having their reputations ruined for failing to solve the case. Then, in November 1975, just weeks before the criminal statute of limitations was set to expire, a friend of the original teenage suspect was arrested on an unrelated charge. He was found carrying a large sum of money. He'd been 18 at the time of the robbery. Police pressed him for an explanation of where the cash had come from, but he refused to speak. Without proof tying his money to the stolen funds, and since it didn't match the serial numbers, they couldn't charge him and had to let him go. Some believe that this individual was, in some way, involved in the original heist, and that he may have been the fake cop himself. In December 1975, exactly 7 years after the crime, the statute of limitations for criminal prosecution expired. The police officially acknowledged that no charges would ever be brought. In a bizarre twist, the investigation had cost an estimated 900 million yen, roughly 3 times the amount that had been stolen in the first place. Then, in 1988, the civil statute of limitations also lapsed, meaning that the perpetrator could now come forward and tell the entire story without facing any legal consequences whatsoever. The fact that the thief has remained silent even after all legal risk evaporated has fueled endless speculation. Some theorists believe the perpetrator died before he could enjoy the money, and that he was perhaps even Boy S himself, despite the police ruling him out. Others have suggested the robbery was the work of a small, organized group, possibly connected to the leftist student movements of the 1960s. Still others believe the sophistication of the operation means that it may have been the work of one of the Yakuza organized crime families. Under this theory, the money never resurfaced, because the heat associated with the crime was much greater than expected. Some have even theorized that the individual responsible may have been silenced permanently by this organization to prevent the details of the crime from ever coming out. Potentially more far-fetched ideas claim that it may have been an intelligence operation by North Korean agents, eager to get their hands on Japanese currency for foreign operations. Under this theory, North Korean agents may have used this money while abroad, posing as Japanese citizens. However, given that none of the stolen money ever re-entered Japan despite over half a century passing, this seems increasingly unlikely. There's a critical detail about this case that often gets overlooked. The robbery was, in a practical sense, victimless, even if the investigation itself wasn't. Nobody was physically harmed during the heist, and the Toshiba employees received their bonuses on time because the money was fully insured. The insurance company's own losses were covered through international reinsurance, meaning the financial impact barely registered domestically. But that hasn't stopped the case from becoming one of the most famous crimes in Japanese history. The robbery has inspired novels, manga, films, and television specials, with the earliest film version coming out in 1975. Notably, the crime has become embedded in Japanese popular culture, in much the same way that the D.B. Cooper hijacking has captivated the American imagination. And it makes sense because the parallels between the two cases are striking in many ways. Both involved lone perpetrators conducting extremely daring crimes for significant amounts of money, as well as a total absence of any meaningful resolution. On the afternoon of February 9, 1989, a 20-year-old University of Florida junior named Tiffany Sessions told her roommate she was heading out for a power walk. It was something she'd been doing regularly since returning from Christmas break, a daily routine along a familiar route near her off-campus apartment in Gainesville. She left sometime between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, wearing red sweatpants, a white pullover sweatshirt with Aspen printed on the collar, and tennis shoes. She had a black Sony Walkman and a distinctive two-tone Rolex watch on her wrist. She didn't take her wallet, her keys, or her identification. She expected to return within the hour, but she never came back, and by around 7 that evening, Tiffany's roommate, Kathleen Frezza, knew something was wrong. She drove along Tiffany's usual walking route, searching for any sign of her. When she found nothing, she called the Alachua County Sheriff's Office, and then Tiffany's parents, Patrick and Hillary Sessions. It was the beginning of one of the largest missing person searches in the history of Florida, and a case that more than 3 decades later still hasn't been fully resolved. Tiffany Sessions was born on October 29, 1968, and her mom, who was in the Air Force, largely raised her on her own as they moved around the country. By the time she reached college, Tiffany had grown into an independent and driven young woman. She was studying finance at the University of Florida, with ambitions of one day running her own company. Her father, Patrick, was a prominent South Florida real estate developer who oversaw some of the largest building projects in the state, and she hoped to work with him one day. She lived in the Casablanca East condominiums on Southwest 35th Place, about 5 miles from the main campus. In what would later be seen as a potential vector of attack, her walking route took her along a wooded stretch of road near clusters of student apartment buildings. In 1989, there was no standardized protocol for missing persons cases in Florida. Hillary later recalled that investigators initially suggested Tiffany might simply be out with friends, a response she found frustrating because it didn't match her daughter's character. There was no evidence of a struggle at Tiffany's apartment, and no indication she'd left the parking lot area voluntarily for any extended trip. Some witnesses reported seeing a woman matching Tiffany's description, speaking to individuals inside a vehicle near her walking route, and the woman may have gotten into the car. However, the witnesses weren't certain, and authorities never confirmed whether the person was actually Tiffany. What was clear from the start was that despite what the cops initially said, this wasn't a voluntary disappearance. Her personal belongings were still in her apartment. Her car was still parked outside. Everything pointed to someone taking her against her will. If the initial law enforcement response was slow to gain traction, Tiffany's father more than compensated. Patrick Sessions threw every resource and connection he had into finding his daughter. Within a week of Tiffany's disappearance, he organized a massive search that even included members of the Miami Dolphins. Volunteers wore white t-shirts emblazoned with Tiffany's name and a toll-free hotline number, and at the peak of the campaign, that hotline was receiving up to 600 calls a day. Patrick didn't stop there, retaining the services of a team of private investigators that specialized in missing persons cases. He got Tiffany's picture printed inside every pizza delivery box in Alachua County so that everyone would be familiar with her appearance. He organized a press conference featuring Dolphins quarterback Dan Marino, John Walsh, and future Florida Governor Jeb Bush, launching the case into the national spotlight. When the local sheriff's office advised that people were trying to contact them by fax, but that they didn't have a fax machine, Patrick bought one for their office. Her case appeared on national television, and Patrick offered a hefty $250,000 reward for information on his daughter. Despite this massive private investigation along with the public investigation, the effort tragically turned up nothing. For years, a convicted criminal named Michael Christopher Knickerbocker drew attention as a possible suspect. Knickerbocker was serving 5 consecutive life sentences for a series of brutal crimes against women and girls. While in prison, he reportedly told fellow inmates that he'd slain Tiffany, claiming he'd chained her to a tree near Gainesville. He claimed that he later disposed of her body in the Caloosahatchee River near Fort Myers. He also claimed her sweatshirt was buried outside of Gainesville, and in 2002, a blood-soaked garment was found in the area. The results of forensic testing on that piece of clothing was never released, and there's nothing to indicate that it was related to the case at this point. Patrick Sessions himself went public in 1994 with his belief that Knickerbocker was involved. But upon further investigation, there was a significant problem when it turned out Knickerbocker wasn't living in Gainesville at the time of Tiffany's disappearance. His known crimes were all committed near victims who lived proximate to him, and investigators began to have doubts. I assume they also had some other reasons to suspect he wasn't involved, but given that this is an active and ongoing investigation, we may never know. When directly confronted by detectives, Knickerbocker never confessed to the crime, but he did provide some information. He admitted to writing an anonymous letter claiming responsibility, though he wouldn't speak on his motives for this. In my view, I suspect that this guy was just a sicko who, having been locked up for life, wanted a way to further victimize innocent people. Also, I say this with the benefit of hindsight, since the other prime suspect seems to fit the fact scenario of her case much better than Knickerbocker. The real breakthrough came decades later, driven in part by a woman who'd never forgotten the case. Sadie Darnell had been an employee of the Alachua County Sheriff's Office when Tiffany disappeared in 1989. Though she was never assigned to the case, she stayed in touch with Patrick Sessions over the years, sending him letters of encouragement. When Darnell was elected sheriff in 2006, she established the county's first cold case unit, with Tiffany's case being marked as high priority. The key development began in 2012, when advancing forensic technology allowed investigators to link DNA evidence to a man named Paul Rowles. But this wasn't in connection to Tiffany's case, but rather in connection to the slaying of Elizabeth Foster. Foster was a 21-year-old Santa Fe Community College student whose body was found in a shallow grave in 1992. She was found roughly a mile from where Tiffany had disappeared 3 years earlier. Interestingly, Hillary Sessions had always believed the two cases were connected, and it turned out she may have been right. Paul Rowles had a deeply troubled history. Born in 1948 in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, he grew up in a severely dysfunctional household. His father, a veteran, was extremely violent, and his mother suffered from serious mental illness and was in and out of institutions. In 1972, Rowles entered Linda Fida's Miami apartment and strangled her. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but under the light sentencing laws of the era, he was paroled in 1985. After his release, he moved to the Gainesville area, where he worked for a company that delivered construction equipment. That job placed him directly along the route Tiffany Sessions walked every afternoon, and chillingly, records showed that Rowles didn't report to work the day Tiffany vanished. If he was the perpetrator, given that Tiffany had a fairly set schedule for her power walks, he could have lurked in the woods waiting for her to come by. In 1994, Rowles kidnapped a 15-year-old girl from her family's apartment in Clearwater, binding her with duct tape after forcing her into his car at knife point. He drove her 200 miles away to Jacksonville, where it became apparent that he wasn't going to let her live. But in a moment of remarkable courage, the teenager managed to escape by unlocking the front door and moving a tire he'd used to barricade it while he wasn't looking. She remains the only known survivor among Rowles's victims, and for this crime he was convicted of kidnapping and indecent assault and sentenced to 19 years in prison. Now I just have to jump in here with my personal commentary, since at this point he was already convicted in relation to the Linda Fida case. I really have to question how someone like this was only given 19 years, meaning that he could have very likely been out prowling the streets once again. Thankfully, though, Rowles' reign of terror was effectively over since he died of lung cancer in prison in February 2013. After his death, investigators gained access to items from his cell, including a calendar and address book that cataloged his victims. The book listed Linda Fida as his first crime, and also contained what appeared to be a reference to Elizabeth Foster. It also contained the notation, Number 2, February 9th, 1989, which investigators believe referred to the date of Tiffany Sessions' disappearance and identified her as Rowles's second victim. I'll come back to this in a second, though, since I don't think this necessarily is as strong circumstantial evidence as the cops believe it is. In February 2014, exactly 25 years after Tiffany disappeared, Sheriff Darnell held a press conference announcing Rowles as the prime suspect. She described the circumstantial evidence as overwhelming, though she acknowledged that a direct connection between Rowles and Tiffany didn't exist. Investigators conducted extensive searches in areas associated with Rolls' other crimes, including a 2-week dig near the site where Foster's body had been found. At one point, sniffer dogs gave strong alerts at several spots, but further excavation revealed the dogs had been reacting to buried septic tanks from an old trailer park. Additional searches in 2020 on a tract of commercial timberland, prompted by tips matching the descriptions of Tiffany and Rolls, also yielded no new evidence. Notably, Tiffany's Rolex watch has been flagged by the manufacturer so that any attempt to sell or pawn it will trigger a notification, but it's never surfaced. Her body has never been found, and she's been excluded from over 150 Jane Doe cases across the United States. Personally, I think the big break may come from that flagged Rolex, which may still be owned by an entirely innocent party. This is speculation on my part, but I suspect he may have sold it for pennies on the dollar immediately after the crime. Perhaps one day the owner of that watch, or their relative, might attempt to sell it, which could trigger a break that confirms Rolls as the culprit. As for that diary connection, I think it's possible that Rolls may have sought to claim an additional victim without actually being involved. We know that he was the sort of person who took pride in his sick acts, and he may have sought to inflate his victim count, as many individuals like this tend to do. That said, this has to be balanced against the fact that he was absent from work on the day she disappeared, as well as his prior and subsequent crimes. There's a gap in one of the most important paintings in the history of Western art, and it's been there for over 90 years. The Ghent altarpiece, also known as the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, was completed in 1432 by the brothers Hubert and Jan van Eyck. It's widely considered the first major oil painting in European art, a groundbreaking work that changed how artists thought about color, light, and realism. It sits today in St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent, Belgium. But if you visit and look at the lower left panel, what you're seeing isn't a Van Eyck original. It's actually a copy. And more interestingly, perhaps, it's a copy by a man that some believe was in on the heist. The real panel, known as the Just Judges, was stolen on the night of April 10th, 1934, and it hasn't been seen since. The panel depicted mounted horsemen riding toward the altarpiece's central scene, where a lamb stands on an altar as a symbol of Christ's sacrifice. The figures are believed to include Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy and possibly the Van Eyck brothers themselves. What happened to it is one of the most tantalizing mysteries in art crime history, and despite decades of investigation, nobody's been able to solve it. On the morning of April 11th, 1934, a bell ringer arrived at St. Bavo's Cathedral to begin his daily rounds. After a few hours, he noticed the lock on the door to the chapel had been forced open. When he entered, 2 panels were missing from the altarpiece: the Just Judges from the interior side, and the painting of St. John the Baptist from the exterior. The panels had been set back to back in an oak frame braced with iron bars, and the entire double-sided unit was gone. It was roughly 5 feet tall and 1.5 feet wide, making it no small feat for anyone to remove in the dark. What followed was a disastrously bungled response, a master class in what not to do following a major art heist. News of the theft leaked immediately, and an estimated 1,500 members of the public flooded into the chapel, trampling through the scene and obliterating any forensic evidence. Hilariously, the Ghent police commissioner showed up briefly before leaving to take lead on an investigation at a separate robbery at a nearby cheese shop. No fingerprints were collected, no photographs were taken. A note left on the altarpiece's frame read, in French, that the panels had been taken by Germany due to the Treaty of Versailles. It was a red herring designed to suggest the theft was German political revenge, referencing the return of several altarpiece panels to Belgium under the treaty's reparation terms. 19 days after the theft, the Bishop of Ghent received a ransom demand for 1 million Belgian francs. If the church didn't pay, the panels would be destroyed. The letter was signed with the cryptic initials DUA. The bishop was willing to negotiate, but the Belgian public prosecutor and the Minister of Justice refused to authorize payment. Higher-ups in the Catholic Church were willing to put forward the money, but the Belgian authorities frowned upon this as setting a dangerous precedent. Nevertheless, the bishop cooperated outwardly and continued a delicate back and forth with the anonymous extortionist. As a gesture of supposed good faith, the thief returned the St. John the Baptist panel, leaving it in the checked luggage department of the Ghent train station. This revealed that the original double-sided panel had been sliced vertically in half, separating the two painted surfaces. This good faith effort by the criminal brought the authorities back on board with some money being set aside for the ransom. A total of 12 letters were exchanged, each containing strange instructions and coded language. At one point, a priest of St. Laurentius Parish in Antwerp was designated to hand over the money. The police gave him a parcel containing only 25,000 francs instead of the demanded million. A taxi driver later arrived at the rectory with a torn newspaper page matching one previously sent by the thief as identification. Despite this, due to the massive disparity in the amounts offered, the negotiations stalled and no exchange was completed. On November 25, 1934, just 7 months after the theft, a stockbroker named Arsène Godertier collapsed from cardiac arrest while delivering a political speech. He was rushed to his brother-in-law's house, where he summoned his lawyer for a private meeting. According to the lawyer, Godertier whispered that he alone knew where the mystic lamb was hidden. He directed his lawyer to a specific drawer in his writing desk at home, marked with the word mutuality, and then he died before being able to say more. The lawyer and his widow eventually searched his study, and inside the desk they found carbon copies of all 12 ransom letters sent to the bishop. There was also a 13th letter that had never been mailed, and it contained a haunting clue. The panel rested in a place where neither Godertier nor anyone else could remove it without drawing public attention. Police concluded that Godertier had been the thief, or at least the mastermind behind the ransom scheme, but the investigation was disastrous. Suspiciously, his lawyer waited over a month to report the findings to the police, and in the meantime, Godertier's widow had ransacked his study and burnt all his papers. The case didn't end with Godertier's death, and if anything, it only grew stranger. One of the biggest questions is whether Godertier could have acted alone. He was an overweight man and suffered from poor eyesight, which would have made it extremely difficult to remove a large panel from a high position on the altarpiece in total darkness. The physical demands almost certainly required at least one accomplice, yet none was ever identified. Some investigators have pointed to 2 men named as possible accomplices, and here it gets weird again. Both of them died within weeks of Godertier, and police never conducted any investigation into their deaths. This suggests that someone may have put a hit out on the co-conspirators, with some believing that it may have been someone from within the police force itself. Then there's the question of motive, since Godertier was incredibly wealthy. He was worth more than 3 million Belgian francs in his accounts at the time of his death, so he clearly didn't need the money. He was one of the wealthiest men in Belgium, and therefore was one of its most trusted citizens. Also, as I was editing this, I realized this Simpsons reference is now probably quite obscure, so I feel the need to clarify that the line was actually a joke. And funny enough, as I was finishing this video up, I realized that my explanation was yet another Simpsons reference, but let's rally and get back on track. One hypothesis holds that he harbored a grudge against the Catholic Church because his father was ousted from a high-ranking civilian role in the church when he was young. According to this theory, the theft was an elaborate act of revenge against the specific bishop. But others believe this doesn't quite hold up, given that Godetier was himself deeply involved in Catholic life and church-related charities. A more dramatic theory ties the theft to the rise of the regime in Germany. The Austrian painter came to power in Germany just 1 year before the panel disappeared, and he had a serious fascination with the Ghent altarpiece. Some researchers believe Godetier and his associates were working on behalf of a German agent, and that the theft was commissioned to secure the panel for the Führer himself. While this theory was popular at the time, after the fall of the Third Reich, it was discovered that the Germans had sent a detective to Belgium specifically to solve the case. The purpose of locating the panel was to give it as a birthday gift for the leader himself sometime after 1940, when Belgium was occupied by Germany. Personally, I don't think it makes a lot of sense that they would go through these efforts if they already had the painting. Still, another theory implicates the diocese itself, and this theory relies on Godetier being a good Catholic who wanted to help out, even in an underhanded way. According to this line of thinking, local clergy had lost money through a failed investment and orchestrated the theft to recoup losses through ransom. Under this theory, they expected the costs of the art to be recouped through the Vatican or through the Belgian state during the ransom. At any rate, since the investigation was so poor and forensic accounting wasn't what it is today, we will never know for sure. One of the strangest chapters in the saga involves Jef van der Weken, the Belgian art restorer who created the replacement copy that hangs in the cathedral today. He was brilliant at his craft, but had a documented history of moonlighting as an art forger. His game was simple. He would offer to restore an aging piece of art, but he would actually create a virtually identical copy, returning the fraudulent art to the owner and keeping the original. Notably, he began working on his replacement in 1939, entirely of his own accord and without any commission from the church or the state. He based his reproduction on a 16th century copy that had been made for Philip II, the Habsburg King of Spain, who was then the ruler of what is now Belgium. The Belgian government eventually purchased his finished work in 1957. What makes van der Weken suspicious, aside from his other art thefts, is a cryptic poem he inscribed on the back of his replica. Written in Flemish, it translates roughly to a declaration of having acted out of love and duty, and of having borrowed from the quote-unquote dark side. Nobody has satisfactorily explained what this means, and some theorists have speculated that van der Weken actually had access to the original panel. Notably, the Ghent Police Department still assigns a detective to the case, and the bishopric continues to receive tips every year. This isn't an entirely cold investigation either, and there has been some fairly recent activity in the case. For instance, in 2019, the authorities actually excavated a square in central Ghent after a theory emerged that the panel might be buried beneath it, but they found absolutely nothing. Over 90 years later, the Just Judges remains one of the most sought-after missing artworks in the world, and there's a good reason for this. The speculative value of the panel is presently thought to be around $100 million, which makes this simple operation one of the biggest art heists in history. Long before scientists arrived at a quiet hillside southwest of Beijing, locals already knew something strange was buried in the earth. They called the place Dragon Bone Hill, named for the peculiar bones that kept turning up in the limestone, which villagers sold to apothecaries as traditional medicine. What they didn't realize was that those bones belonged to creatures far more significant than any mythical dragon. In 1918, Swedish geologist Johan Gunnar Andersson was directed to a fossil-rich cave system near the town of Jokudien. roughly 50 kilometers from Beijing. By 1921, Anderson and Austrian paleontologist Otto Zadansky had begun formal excavations, and Zadansky quietly discovered a human tooth at the site. When he finally reported the find in 1926, the scientific community took notice. Canadian anatomist Davidson Black, working at the Peking Union Medical College, secured Rockefeller Foundation funding to launch a systematic excavation. Based on isolated teeth, Black classified the specimens as a new genus and species in 1927, calling it Sinanthropus pekinensis. It was a gutsy move based on very little physical evidence, but Black was convinced something monumental lay waiting in the caves. He wasn't wrong, and on December 2nd, 1929, Chinese geologist Pei Wenzhong made the breakthrough. Working deep inside a frigid 40-meter crevasse with nothing but a hammer and a candle, Pei extracted a nearly complete skull cap from the red sandy clay. It was the first substantial cranial evidence of what we now classify as Homo erectus ever found in China. The discovery electrified the paleontological world and reshaped conversations about human evolution. Over the following years, excavations at Zhoukoudian yielded an extraordinary haul. By 1937, scientists had recovered over 200 fossils from more than 40 individuals, including 5 nearly complete skull caps, numerous teeth, jawbones, and limb fragments. They also found thousands of stone tools and evidence of controlled fire use, painting a rich picture of early hominids who had inhabited these caves around 500,000 years ago. Davidson Black didn't live to see his life's work threatened. He died of a heart attack at his desk in 1934, reportedly with one of the skull caps sitting right in front of him. German anatomist Franz Weidenreich, who had fled Germany, was appointed to continue the research. Weidenreich proved meticulous, overseeing the creation of detailed plaster casts, photographs, and scientific illustrations of every specimen. This painstaking documentation would later prove to be an act of extraordinary foresight, given the uncertainty and conflict that was on the horizon. In 1937, Japan invaded China proper after having previously invaded Manchuria about a half-decade earlier, and excavations at Zhoukoudian ground to a halt. Reports emerged of brutal treatment of workers at the site, including the slaying of at least 3 laborers by Japanese soldiers. As the conflict intensified, the safety of the fossils became urgent. Weidenreich transferred the collection to a safe at the Peking Union Medical College, hoping an American-run institution would offer protection. He figured that the Japanese wouldn't be silly enough to attack an American college in China and bring down the full force of the United States on the island. But despite believing in his plan, Weidenreich repeatedly urged college head Henry Houghton to authorize shipping the fossils to the United States just in case. Houghton initially refused, and it wasn't until September 1941 that the U.S. Embassy finally authorized the transfer. Weidenreich departed China that year, taking his casts and research notes to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. What happened next remains one of the most agonizing mysteries in the history of science. In late November 1941, the fossils were carefully wrapped in cotton, tissue paper, and gauze, then packed into 2 wooden military footlockers. The plan was straightforward. U.S. Marines would transport the crates from the Peking Union Medical College to the port city of Qinhuangdao. There they'd be loaded onto the SS President Harrison and shipped to the American Museum of Natural History. The fossils left the college on December 4th, 1941, and 3 days later was December 7th, which, to quote Roosevelt, was a day that would live in infamy. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the SS President Harrison was intercepted by Japanese ships and ran aground before it could reach port. The Marines who were supposed to oversee the fossils' safe passage were taken prisoner. and the 2 footlockers containing the remains of at least 40 Homo erectus simply vanished. No one has ever definitively established what happened to them after they left the medical college that December morning. Japanese scientists, who had coveted the collection, raided the laboratory shortly after and were reportedly furious to find the fossils gone. They had planned on using these fossils to prove that humans came from Asia, with the intent being to prove that the Japanese were the most superior of all. An American lab associate was held and interrogated for 5 days about their whereabouts, but he couldn't provide answers because he genuinely didn't know where they'd ended up. In the decades since then, theories about the fossils' fate have multiplied. Some researchers believe the crates made it as far as Camp Holcomb, the Marine base near Qinhuangdao, but were never loaded onto a ship due to the chaos of the Pearl Harbor attack. If that's the case, an officer may have buried them near one of the camp's permanent structures, intending to retrieve them later but never surviving to do so. Others have speculated that Japanese soldiers intercepted the crates during transport and either confiscated the contents or, not recognizing their value, discarded them. One persistent rumor suggests the fossils ended up aboard the Japanese vessel Awa Maru, which was sunk by an American submarine in 1945. Another disturbing theory holds that the bones were ground up and sold as traditional medicine, their scientific significance completely unknown to whoever possessed them. The search efforts over the years have been colorful, to say the least, and oddly various federal agencies have investigated leads at various points. A mysterious woman claiming to be the widow of one of the Marines guarding the fossils once met a Chicago businessman at the top of the Empire State Building. She showed him photographs she said depicted the missing bones and then vanished forever. Other verified con artists periodically surfaced claiming to possess the fossils, demanding million-dollar ransoms. One desperate researcher even enlisted a professional psychic who had previously attempted to locate Bigfoot using a dowsing rod. Unsurprisingly, though, none of these less conventional efforts produced results. The most credible lead emerged in 2010 when paleoanthropologist Lee Berger at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa received an email out of the blue. It was from Paul Bowen, son of former Marine Corporal Richard Bowen. The elder Bowen hadn't been at Camp Holcomb when the fossils first went missing in 1941. He'd been stationed there in 1947 during the Chinese Civil War, when the camp was caught between nationalist and communist forces. According to his account, while digging foxholes one night, as the base came under attack from tens of thousands of communist soldiers, he unearthed a wooden crate filled with bones. Under fire, he reburied the box and used it as a makeshift machine gun nest, after which he was captured shortly afterward and never returned. Berger verified Bowen's identity and military records, then traveled to Qinhuangdao, where he linked up with Chinese scholars. A local historian, who actually remembered the American Marines, helped them locate the former site of Camp Holcomb, and what they found was disheartening. The area had been completely industrialized, covered in warehouses, roads, and asphalt. The most probable location of the buried crate now sits beneath a parking lot. The team couldn't excavate, but noted the area was slated for redevelopment, which could allow for future investigation. Local cultural heritage authorities committed to monitoring any construction for signs of the footlockers. However, many people have questioned whether a developer who came upon these priceless cultural artifacts would turn them over to the authorities. After all, this would be the permanent end to any development on the site, with no guarantee of any sort of recourse against the government. The loss of the Peking man fossils is often called one of the greatest tragedies in science history. They represented the largest collection of Homo erectus remains ever found at a single site. No chemical analysis or advanced testing was ever performed on the originals before they disappeared, meaning entire categories of scientific inquiry were closed. Modern techniques like DNA extraction and isotopic analysis could reveal extraordinary information about these early humans that simply can't be obtained from plaster casts. Yet there's a small consolation in Weidenreich's extreme thoroughness and dedication to the project. His casts, photographs, and detailed illustrations preserved enough information that the loss didn't entirely halt scientific progress. Further yet, there's a common misconception that all the bones from the site were permanently lost, which isn't true, even if the vast majority were. Excavations at Zhoukoudian resumed after order had been restored to China and continued through subsequent decades, yielding additional specimens. But like I said, these are a small fraction of what was available, and whether the full trove will ever be recovered is anyone's guess.